Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, or potentially good evening, depending where you are. Happy to present to you today. For any one of you who was at my GDC talk, this will be the same talk that was given earlier this week. But for the rest of you, I hope you get something out of it. And without further ado, I will go ahead and start. My name's Amir Ebrahimi. I'm with Unity Technologies. I work in the labs group, and currently I'm working on VR authoring in VR. At GDC on Tuesday, we had our Dev Days conference, which is a full day of Unity content, and we kicked it off with a VR talk we entitled Eyes Wide Open. Moving into 2016 and doing VR, fully aware of everything that you need to think of as you build content this year. So I'm going to switch over to my slides and we'll get started. So originally I gave this talk with Pete Moss out of our Seattle Creative Content Studio. I didn't figure that I would bother Pete to join me at 8 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday here in the Pacific time zone. So, but I do want to give thanks to Pete for helping prepare the talk and assembling our resources. So, why this talk? If you are new to VR, you're probably somewhat aware of the hype around it, just the buzz around it. I mean, at this year at GDC, VRWTB had to move locations because there was so much interest in the talks. They had overflow rooms, and from Monday to Tuesday decided to move the conference sessions over to the North Hall where there was double the capacity. So some of you may be coming to this talk with this in mind. And, I'll just say right off that, this talk hopefully will be a sobering up around the market, where we are technically, where we are design wise. And then, so one thing I'll say is I'm putting this bit.ly link up first, and I did this at the talk, just in case any of you, if you find that you are not getting much out of the talk, if you're already farther along in your VR development, at the very least, I'd like you to have these resources that we compiled as we prepared our talk. So I'm going to leave this up for a few more seconds, then I'll move on. So feel free to go ahead and download that. You can follow along. They aren't the slides, although I know that with the best plans to Be My App will be putting those slides up after the talk at some point. So why this talk? So this talk is here to save you time. So if you were to think of, if you've ever seen Flight of the Conchords, their business manager, he'll always, I think his name's Murray, and he always, he might ask a question like, so I kind of like, I'm channeling Murray in the sense that he might ask VR, what's that all about? And if you were to have someone task rabbit this stuff and pull together resources, that's kind of the point of this talk. It's really to save you time researching and just really to have a good set of resources as you get started in VR. So we're going to take a look at the business and the market. We're going to take a look at some of the technical considerations you need to be thinking of, some of the design decisions, and then also how you can market your apps in this early space of VR, or in the space of VR during this early time. So I like to think of 2016 as the year of survival for VR developers. If you were at VRX conference in San Francisco, this isn't all that new of a concept. However, you have to think about surviving through this early stage of adoption so that when you reach 2017 and beyond, you can really thrive. You know, a lot of times I hear devs say, well, you know, I would like to, you know, when I ask, you know, are you doing anything in VR? They say, well, the market's not really there, so they want to wait till the market is there. And I think depending on the studio and what you're currently doing, that makes sense. I would hope that at least at all studios, there's at least some small group of people who are doing development in VR, at least trying some things out. So some of these mistakes can be made, or learnings actually can be made early. So at our Vision Summit keynote in 2016, just this year, last month, John Riccitiello, you know, kind of went out there boldly and presented an alternative adoption curve for VR. So, you know, he was presenting before some of the curves you see out there. The predictions show, you know, a steady climb from 2016 and moving forward for VR adoption. And you will see, like, along the left side, I don't know if my pointer can probably even be seen, but along the left side, if you look at where that graph starts on the y-axis, it starts pretty high. And, you know, if you look at JR's curve, it starts a little bit lower, but then, of course, exponentially it increases over time. So what he brought up, which I think is the key point here, is there's the potential for this gap of disappointment, and not with the technology itself, but with the promotion of, at least in the media, of what VR is, or what VR will be this year. So, I mean, for everyone in the VR industry, I would say the more we can minimize or mitigate this, the better we'll all be off, because that gap of disappointment will be less of a concern. However, I will say that that JR at the talk said that this is not going to be a big deal in the long term. It's not something we need to be concerned with. It's not going to make or break the industry. It's really just affecting the start of VR. So, you know, he said, have no doubts. Like, this won't be that big of an issue many years beyond, obviously, when we've caught up on the curve. So then, you know, with the adoption curve being what it is, and well, I'll put out there potentially, you know, who knows? Maybe everyone in the world goes out and buys, you know, high-end PCs, and we have just a mass conversion that we've never seen before. But, you know, if you're wondering, and I'll just quote Julian Lynch from Arch Virtual, a company that's working with VR in the business-to-business space, primarily around architectural visualization. He said, if you're sitting here wondering how am I going to make money with VR, then definitely he suggests looking into the business-to-business side of things. His talk is in the resources PDF, and there's a link to the video from Vision Summit that you can hear him talk more at length about that. So then Deloitte recently put out a predictions for 2016, and it's part of a larger report around telecommunications, media. But what's cool about it is they decided to take a look at VR as well. So I was surprised because, you know, it's a great report. It's in the resources PDF. They kind of break down the different sectors, and one of the things they broke out, at least for enterprise adoption, will be that, you know, expect 2016 to be a year of experimentation. So, you know, I'm just pulling a few quotes out to kind of set the stage. And then Neil Schneider, executive director of the ITA, in a recent Gama Sutra article said, you know, that 2016 is going to be a modest introductory year instead of a bang from rags to riches. Okay, so quite a buzzkill for all of us who are quite excited about the technology and about, you know, about VR as a whole and what impact it'll have on everyone. So then what? So then I like to contrast what I just shared with a recent announcement from Alchemy Labs that they're going all in on VR. And you know, they have been experimenting with VR since its early days. If you've been following their development, but recently announcing going all in on VR. They are one of the launch titles on the Vive, and I'm not sure, they might be one on the Oculus as well with their game Job Simulator. However, what I'd like to impart to you guys is even even with where the adoption curve is, I would impress on you to start now and to start experimenting and again, having those learnings early so that when the market is there, the risks are much less in terms of missing the mark when there is a market, a market there for everyone. So let's move on to devices. Where are we in with devices? So we've got, we've got a few different categories. These are just my terms. I just tried to throw them out there to kind of segment the devices. I'm not going to go ahead and read through these. You can see these. But I will point out that the tween range right now is an interesting one. So just earlier this week on Monday, AMD announced that their chips were going in the Sulon Q, which is a device that is wireless. It has the CPU and the GPU built into the actual headset itself. So, but it's higher end than a mobile device. So something to consider, when you're thinking about what you want to develop for, or just know that we've got a wide range of devices. So again, and I'll get into this later about the technical considerations around that. So again, this is a dense slide. I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to call out a few points. These are the release dates, prices, and the estimated units. So my one point is, if you're building VR right now and you want the widest reach, according to Google, based on actual units shipped, cardboard is out there to the count of 5 million. So, and we can thank the New York Times, the recent push they did with New York Times for all of those devices out there. And as they reported at Vision Summit, there is still a good retention of those original cardboard users, that they are still consuming content to date. So, so something to think about if you're wanting the widest reach. Beyond that, you'll see that the other numbers are varying. All I'll say is this. If you are considering doing desktop class VR, consider that the number of GPUs that are actually out there in the wild that can run this content. Now, I will say on, I believe it was Thursday, to finish off the day, Alex Vlachos from Valve had given a talk on advanced VR rendering. And they're doing some really great stuff there, all of which will come to Unity developers. Although it's not specific to Unity, so if you're doing stuff in another engine or your own custom one, you should definitely check it out in terms of the findings he had from his research. And the big key is the Valve VR demo is actually able now to run on the 680 NVIDIA chipset, which is a 4-year-old card. So that really changes the game. Although it's not in the recommended min spec, it does change the game in terms of potential GPUs that can run this content. So something to watch. And then, I'll say the final highlight is the PlayStation VR really is a sleeper hit for me. It's, you've got 36 million PlayStation 4s out there. You've got a price point of, and I didn't update this slide because they just announced this, it's $399. So, you've got a low price point, certainly something to keep in mind as you are thinking about what platforms to support. On the features side, another dense slide. I'll just give you a chance to digest that, but I'm not going to go through it all. Wherever there's comments in some of the green parts, know that, for instance, Oculus Rift, they don't promote that it's room scale. However, certainly there is more room to experiment with larger tracking spaces if you use multiple trackers. They also do have tracked controllers coming soon. But currently it ships with a single tracker and a gamepad, so something to keep in mind. I'm going to move through a little faster because I'm realizing I'm not keeping to my 30-minute time for the presentation. So, okay, so let's move into input. How do you do input? Well, on Cardboard and Gear VR, the primary input mechanism would be gaze selection. So that's just simply wherever you're looking, you would be able to select objects. And a great example of that is Land's End on the Gear VR by the US2. So know that also I've put resources for all of these input modes in the resources PDF. You can find out great how-tos on how to implement these things. And quite frankly, a lot of them come with the SDK or our own samples nowadays. For cardboard, you have a single button on the left side, so you can use that for some of your selection. I'm noticing a few questions. I'll try and answer some of these since I'm just seeing it right now. No announcement on when native cardboard integration will come in, but that should be coming soon. I mean, it is in the works. Gear VR touchpad. Gear VR has a touchpad on the side. That's how you can do both tapping, and you do have a mouse-like surface, so you can track swipes and other gestures, and also just direct input. Gear VR, and for the Oculus Rift as well, you can consider, at least on the Oculus Rift, you most likely want to consider using the gamepad, but also in Gear VR, there's the ability to have a wireless gamepad and connected to the device. And then on Vive and PlayStation VR, we do have track controllers. So this is a great video from Alex from Alchemy Labs doing juggling in VR with his own job simulator app. Okay, so how do you actually get VR enabled in Unity? So in the player settings, you check a checkbox that says virtual reality supported. And I'll explain what this does. But notice that if you've been using Unity prior to this box has changed for the Unity 5.4 beta, which is available for download. This allows you now to add multiple support for virtual reality SDKs and prioritize which of these devices you would like to pick first. So potentially at some point, Google Cardboard would fall in here. And then also I think there's even stereo support as a complete fallback. What this checkbox does is it handles all the initialization of the devices. It will also, it'll drive the main camera in your scene. So whichever camera you have selected as main will be driven by the HMD, as well as, you still have support to control which eyes render, which cameras render to which eye, or you could control the IPD for the rendering. All those things are extensible, but at least at the very base level, you can check this box, enable the SDKs you want, and it should just work. So on the technical side, let's talk quickly about maintaining frame rate, because you've got 90, the target, at least on desktop class VR, is 90 FPS. And I would say, so that's 11 milliseconds. But after seeing Alex Vlachos's talk at GDC, I would say you should really consider a 10 millisecond time slice, because essentially the OS still needs some time to composite what's showing up on the main screen on the computer. And you need to leave that extra room, because you really aren't going to get all 11 milliseconds of that slice. So how can you maintain that frame rate? Well, anyone who's been developing for mobile will recognize a lot of these things that you need to do, because we've been doing it for mobile for some time. So, that's baked lighting and global illumination. Well, GI, you would, if you were going to use any of that, you would bake it or use light probes. Occlusion culling is something that we've had in the product for a long time, and definitely would want to do that for just to help with overdraw. Batching, there's built-in batching, so you can mark objects as static or dynamic. Well, you can mark them as static, or otherwise they might be able to go to the dynamic batcher depending on how many polygons are in the object. There's also a great asset store plugin called Mesh Baker, which allows you to bake your meshes and have a lot more control over that baking if you like. And then share materials to reduce draw calls. That goes in line with batching, but also in general, like even for your dynamically rendered objects, having less material switches on the GPU will help you. There is, I would also say, consider using LODs to reduce complexity for your scene complexity. Simply Gone is a great plugin, or not just plugin for Unity, but a separate standalone product that can help you generate those level of details for your objects. This next point is an interesting one because it's not completely true that all full screen image effects are expensive, but most of them are going to affect your frame rate if, because all the, not all these techniques were considered specifically for VR. So I would say if you are going to use them sparingly and, consider what other ways you can get the final look you're looking to get without having to use those. So the VR specific optimizations, I'm going to go and move on to the next slide. If you were at Vision Summit, then you might have seen this or if you've watched the videos online. So this is a comparison between 5.3 and future versions of Unity, which I'm going to walk through quickly. This was a game, I think, from Ubisoft. We were trying out their new flying game. I forget the name of it, where you're flying through Paris. And if you look, the rendering is just making it under, not the rendering, the CPU is just making it under 11 milliseconds on the main thread. But if you look, our render thread is over our 11 milliseconds that we need. So with 5.4, just general optimizations with 5.4, our main thread is down to 7.4 milliseconds, and our render thread comes in right at 11. However, let's move farther with that. So, or further with that. So, double wide rendering is something where we are now testing out rendering both eyes on the same rendered target, and we have custom shader. We're making use of extensions in order to do that, and the shaders are essentially sending off the left and right eye separately, but with a single draw call. The best I understand it right now, because I know our other teams are working on that. They probably would say be able to explain that better than I do currently, but essentially that right there gives us quite a lot of savings on the main thread. Because we are able to issue less draw calls. So with 5.4 with double wide, we have, so actually I was mistaken on the graph. So we're down to 4 milliseconds on the main thread, huge increase in performance there. And then on the render thread down to 7.3 milliseconds. So what's great is now we're well under the 11 millisecond, but we can go one further. So one thing we're doing in 5.4 as a beta is we now have all of our render loops Jobified, essentially. They run on separate threads, and the main thread is freed up to do the stuff that you guys want it to do, which is your own scripts. And with that, we're down to 1.9 milliseconds on the main thread, not overall. So know that your other threads are actively working, but at least on the main thread down to 1.9 seconds. And small increase in improvement on the render thread. So other considerations. So when you're doing UI, you definitely need to be doing it in world space. Well, I'll say, when I say definitely, let me be careful about that, because everything in VR, my main thing with anything in VR is try it out. So if someone asks, like, what should I do with UI? Well, try it out and see for yourself. I'm just reporting what people have done and what's worked up till now. But certainly, I don't want us to be, as an industry, being locked into only thinking about things in a certain way. There's so much room for creativity and finding out what's going to work. And quite frankly, it's fun to test boundaries. However, world space UI, I'll at least explain why why it's being set to do things this way. You know, if you have UI affixed to the camera, it's reported by some to be nauseating. So like if you have something, think of like just something hanging on your head in front of you and moving with you. So you know what's suggested is that you actually use Unity's UI in world space, have it out there in the scene. And then in terms of camera distance, this one I might challenge a bit more, but the idea is that as you bring things closer to the head, it actually becomes hard for the eyes to focus for things that get as close as 1 meter. Again, I would say set up something and play around with that. But if you're looking for comfort, generally 2 to 3 meters away from you is a comfortable area to focus on. So the other thing too that I'd say is getting is not getting enough attention in the industry is sound spatializers. So having proper spatialization and not just playing a sound in 3D. I mean, that's been done in almost every 3D engine for quite a while. But the point is getting accurate audio to the left and right ear. And with these plugins, you can do that. I realize I'm probably not going to hit the time on this. So again, I'm just going to move forward quite faster. Know that a lot of our resources are in our PDF. So most of these are going to go into a lot more depth about everything that I'm talking about today. So, but generally, how would you design a VR app? Well, you could go the approach of augmenting an existing app with VR or doing a port, or you could choose to go VR native. And you know, our opinion, this was Pete and I's, is that if you're going to do VR, go all in with it. You know, make it a VR first app. And if you're not going to bet the whole company on it, which I would, you know, I have no judgments about companies that want to play it safe. But if you are going to experiment, I would say that, you know, at least if you are going to put a small team on it, consider just creating something that you're going to experiment with in VR and find out what the best, the best strengths for the platform would be based on your experimentation. Again, you got to try and see what works. Anyone who says that, you know, this is the only way you can do things in VR, I would say they're probably wrong. So design considerations. When you're designing for VR, I would say consider one of 3 things. Are you looking for widest reach? In that case, you might want to consider the Google Cardboard. Are you looking for potential sales? So then look at where the market will be this year. And that was based on those slides. I was saying the estimates for some of the platforms, you know, PlayStation VR being what could be a sleeper hit this year. And then if you're designing for studio survival, you may not want to even consider the consumer devices right now. You might want to look at, well, B2B, what can I do there? Because, you know, Audi is talking about having VR configurators in their dealerships, and that work's already been done. And there is certainly a lot of other enterprise potential adoption for VR where there are spaces that people will go to and experience these things. So there's certainly money there that could help your studio survive and allow you to do some experimentation with VR on your own. But the one thing I will say is the main design consideration is you must, see, I got to be careful because I'm going to be a hypocrite. Generally, what I'll say is if someone's not comfortable in VR, it's going to be hard for them to try further experiences. So one of the design considerations I would say, I won't say you must do, because maybe you do want to play with that. If, you know, I mean, I'm sure we're going to have plenty of barf simulators in VR at some point, but you know, consider building for comfort is something you hold at least high in the design consideration slide. So best practices. 1 second, I'm gonna take a quick break. So you have some water. Best practices. So frame rate is definitely king. I would say drop frames are not worth having better graphics. So what most people are finding, if you've ever tried Job Simulator, is that these tune graphics are quite, I mean, once you're in there, it's more about the presence than it is about having realistic graphics. So definitely try it out for yourself and see what work, what seems reasonable for your own team. However, I would say as if you user test, your app, maybe you should play with different levels of graphics if you are trying to answer that question or challenge, what I'm putting out here. You don't have to believe me necessarily. But my own experience personally has been that when I'm in it, it doesn't matter if I have Mickey Mouse hands or, like everything looks cartoony. I'm in it and I'm experiencing that world is believable. So the other thing too is usually you say don't prematurely optimize, but I'll say VR is such a tight or hard performance limit to hit that I would consider optimizing early and often on that. You also want to watch for memory allocation so you avoid spikes from the GC. That's huge, but if you've been working in mobile, you already know about that. Again, reduce poly count and texture sizes. But in this case, I would say I would err on the side of optimizing early rather than waiting till the end of your project and then seeing where performance is lagging and trying to optimize that point, because it might impact a whole pipeline of art that you've already created. Interface you designed. I'm over the 30 minutes, so I'm just gonna say go to the docs. There's a super list of all. I think on our mega list, there's a link to another list of a bunch of UX and UI considerations. The main thing here to think about is I would say reactivity. So just having response to things. If you're putting your hand in something, it's changing color, it's changing audio. If you're using a pointer, there's just reactivity in the environment all around. So animation, sound, color changes. That's the main thing that I'm walking away with after doing quite a bit of development. And then marketing your VR app. I'm going to give a plug for our Made with Unity site. This is a great way to feature your own team and really tell your story aside from just the game itself, because we're finding there's quite a lot of readership that actually cares about the developers and their own stories. So consider posting there and creating a site. We do curate that and promote content to the front page. The VR forums at Unity are a good place. For industry news, Upload VR, Road to VR are, I'd say, essential. Definitely consider sharing your VR app early as possible on the Oculus Share or Steam, and it can be a demo version. I'm seeing someone mentioned a name there. This certainly isn't a comprehensive list, and the resources PDF has more. If I had made it a wiki, you could probably add, people could add a lot more sites to this, but this is a general starter for most people, at least what I could find. And the big thing is, I would say, have as many people try your app as possible. I would probably go out there and say that most people aren't just going to steal your content and build. I mean, we all know it's expensive to build anything with any team size. Well, besides a team of one, it costs a lot to build content in general for 3D apps or for apps, games, or so. My suggestion is show as many people as possible, get as much feedback as you possibly can. And that really is what I would say is, like, you're joining this awesome community of VR developers. Everyone I've seen is so happy to share their content around and talk with other developers and share their learning. So know that if you're just coming in, that is really the community you're coming into. So I would just encourage you to embrace it and share and even potentially blog post quite a bit about the developments of your own game as you're building it. That's certainly been helpful for other developers as they build their own communities around their games. Okay, so to finish things off, the future, I'd say something I'm directly interested in, what I'm working on, and what's been announced at our keynote this week at GDC, is just the authoring VR in VR. So looking at that space of being in VR as you're creating your own experiences. The HRTF stuff, I'd say still not, it's not everywhere, but you know, the earlier you jump on that, I think the better you'll, I mean, think about, you know, when you're talking about presence in VR, you have the visual input, which is a major one, but audio is such a close second in terms of building that presence. You know, because essentially we're tricking our reptilian brain. So the other thing to keep close watch is Apple and Google. There's, I mean, we're also waiting to see what Apple's got. You know, we've heard rumblings of their patents there, and Google, although Cardboard's been a great success for them, I'm quite sure they got to be thinking about something on the higher end side, or mobile premium. And I'm saying this coming from not knowing. This isn't me knowing anything that's coming and just because of NDA not sharing. This is really me not just being alongside the rest of you, not knowing what's planned for these companies. But I do think they're important to watch. And then AR, you know, this talk was about VR, but AR is also an interesting space. So I do think it's a little bit farther off personally, but it's interesting to see the developments that come from that, because there is some possible applications in VR. So I would say consider 2016 the year of experimentation. Consider B2B as enterprise adoption might happen faster, or at least not faster in terms of units sold, but definitely probably, I would say, from what I've heard from other companies that are doing B2B, there is money out there to be had this year in 2016. And I'd say no time to waste, get to it. So with that, there's the link again for the doc. It's in the chat window as well. And I'm gonna go ahead and switch back over to video for questions. So first question is, yeah, how much C# do you need to get to know to get started in VR? Not quite much. It's, I mean, when I'd say the challenge you're probably facing is more on the input side than the VR side. So when you check that box in Unity to enable VR development, if you have your HMD hooked up, it just works. I mean, you can have an empty scene with no game objects at all, but if you have VR checked, you'll notice that you can look around and you'll be seeing the skybox, but certainly you don't need to know any C# for that. But beyond that, yes, you are going to start to build, you know, once you build your content, you're going to have more complexities with what you're building. So if you aren't a programmer, you might consider using a visual scripting tool. There are plenty of those in the asset store. So next question. Does using Leap with Oculus cause much frame rate drop? It's hard to answer that question without knowing specs, so I don't know what specific specs you're talking about. I will say this, the Leap motion with the latest Orion SDK has gotten a lot better. I'm gonna have to scroll up because the questions are coming too fast. The Leap motion, the Orion SDK has improved their tracking quite a lot. So if you tried Leap before and you gave up on it, you might want to consider trying it again. I don't know in terms of milliseconds how much they're taking though on the CPU for processing their data. So definitely something to keep in mind, as you only have, I would say, 10 milliseconds to work on that stuff. So what gives a better experience, Unreal or Unity, for both the developer, designer, and user? I love these questions. I'll say it's still on my own map to try Unreal's tools. It's been a while. I used to teach at Art Institute in addition to working in the industry. This is prior to me working at Unity, so I was using other engines, and I have used Unreal before back then, but a lot of stuff has changed since then. I don't know. I mean, it's like saying which is a better 3D application, Max or Maya. It really depends on what you're used to building your 3D, you know, what you were trained on. So you can definitely build VR in both Unreal and Unity. I would say, I can't really speak, but you were asking whether it was better for developers or designers or users. I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm certainly not going to sway you one way or the other. There's probably plenty of forums where people are hating on Unity or hating on Unreal, but I hope maybe that was somewhat helpful. Will mobile VR turn into a Facebook versus Google war? I don't even know what mobile VR is yet. I mean, is Facebook just going to bring a pane into the window and it's just my Facebook feed right in VR? So I have no response for that. I think that's quite a ways off. I will say, Facebook buying Oculus for $2 billion. They probably do have some interest in turning that into VR social. HoloLens support in 5.4. I don't know. I can say this: is HoloLens working with Unity at some factor? Yes, and I think Microsoft even mentioned that. There's no release date on that. Or no announcement. So I'm not going to misspeak on that front. I'm sorry about that. If my game is currently running at 60 FPS, what would be the first thing to look at to get to 90 FPS? Well, I mean, first thing, it would be important to know what device you're building for. So if you're building for Gear VR, know that I believe 60 FPS is the target. Gear VR is 75 hertz, 90 FPS on the, this is where I'm not completely sure. Just know that there is a varying level of what things run at. Desktop class is 90 hertz. I think DK2 runs at 75 hertz, although that's not a supported HMD moving forward. It will still work, but it's not supported by Oculus. And then I believe the mobile, and I think Gear VR might be 60 FPS. So you might be okay if you are at 60 FPS, but if you're looking to get to 90 FPS, some of the things you'd certainly want to pull up the profiler to see, even on your PC, where you're spending time. You need to find out if you're CPU bound or GPU bound. And that just means, am I spending more time on my CPU, which is leaving my GPU idle, or am I spending more time on the GPU where my CPU is sitting idle? So, and then that can tell you where to move things. Because if you're GPU bound, that means likely you're either, your pixel shaders are too expensive, you're sending too much down the pipe in general for the GPU. If you're CPU bound, then that means your scripts might be too complex. So hopefully that will show up easily on your on the Unity profiler, and you can see, where your biggest buck is for where your biggest bang for the buck would be on the profiler for that. Generally, though, you said the first thing to look at, it's probably the number of things you're rendering. So, depending on draw distance and culling, you might look at using some occlusion culling for your objects. So I hope that's helpful. I'm going to move on since there are still some questions here. What's your target? So my personal target platform of choice, I personally love the Vive. I think it's awesome to develop in room scale and for those experiences. I will say, even at my home, I have a Vive. I've tried to set it up, and it still requires me to push the couch back. So I'm not sure yet how that works in the long term for the consumer market. But just as a personal experiencing the tech, I'm just stoked about the Vive. I will say, personally, I use the Oculus at my desktop just because it's an easier setup for us. For me right now, but one thing we're considering in the labs group is setting up 2 lighthouses and then having all of us being able to use those lighthouses for our Vive setups, even at a desktop. So to do a sitting setup for that. Oh, someone actually found something. Okay, yeah, someone found a reference to Unity in the HoloLens docs, but yeah, if you look, it says coming soon. And great, someone confirmed Gear VR is 60 hertz. What is the main application you're developing for VR? I don't know if that's aimed towards me or others. For me, in labs, I'm working on authoring in VR. So if you can see the keynote from GDC, we actually demo that. We also showed it at the Vision Summit. Let's see. So the question is, you've said that B2B, oh wait, I'm sorry, I'm missing a question. What would be the kind of modules you would hope to see on a course? So this question is about development courses for Unreal and Unity. What kind of modules would we hope to see? What are the best things to learn? Well, it depends on where people are coming from. If there's no programming experience, then regardless of VR, they would probably benefit from learning programming courses. But if it's a VR specific course, I think what's interesting is spending some time in the course on the biomechanics behind it, and just the proprioception, talking about some of the concepts of why we even get VR presence. The other part too is with visual design and architecture, bringing in things that aren't, outside of the normal realm of VR, to figure out how to design spaces better for VR. Because as we have this presence, we now have the ability to make use of silhouettes and the spaces, how they're laid out. Carl Callewaert from Unity has a great talk about this. It is on the Vision Summit YouTube site, and it talks about he calls it Genius Loci. I don't know a lot about it, so I'm just going to say he goes into depth about how perspective works. I mean, he was in architecture before, so really great stuff there. And then next question is, you said that B2B has a lot of opportunity. Do you see educational institutions as having a similar opportunity? Are university and school systems investing deeply enough in the hardware for larger scale educational products to succeed? So I can't really speak from actual data. My gut is that with school systems probably not having a lot of resources to spend on VR equipment, I hope to see more donations in that space of potentially like even DK2s going to some of the school systems. But on the university side, I would say the universities are probably all have VR hardware if they have a computer science department or a graphics department. So in terms of B2B opportunity, potential there, I would say that to me is more likely right now. If you wanted to develop something that was going to hit the market, or you already were developing something that's going to hit the market in 2016, there's certainly more consolidated dollars that can come from a business or an institution than the masses spending a small amount on content. Some back and forth between question, Carl, who has the talk. I'm not sure if that is for me or not. There's a question about, do you think the HoloLens will be able to fix a small viewport issue? I mean, if you've tried the hardware, that's, the hardware is already set. So they have when you try HoloLens, you have a much larger screen, but you do have just a sliver of that. Long term, oh, cool, I'll answer that in a second. Long term, I do think, our lenses can get bigger for the HoloLens. I'm not sure of all the details. I should just shut up at this point because I'm not talking about something I don't really know about. You might want to contact someone on the HoloLens team about that. So what are the solution challenges for heavy text input in VR? Alex Vlachos talked about this at his Valve talk, and I would just reiterate that it's probably a good idea. There is a threshold of if you degrade your render target resolution. So there's a render scaling property in VR. I think it's under our Unity engine. If you import Unity engine.vr, you'll have access to those VR settings, and one of them is render scale, and you can actually dial it back to like 0.8 or even 0.5. And through testing, Alex Vlachos determined that 0.8 at least on the Vive, 0.8 render scale is really the lowest you want to go in terms of text input, what's readable at a reasonable distance. The other thing that you should consider using is signed distance fonts, SDF. It was using Half-Life 2 and the Source Engine, and I think there is a plugin for Unity. It's kind of a way to get vectorized looking fonts there. The other trick too, so you asked about the challenges though as well. One of the things with VR is we have this asynchronous time warp, which means as I move my head, and if I haven't rendered a frame quick enough, then it's going to rotate the view. It's going to grab last frames and try to interpolate, and that ends up blurring text mostly. So at least know on Oculus VR there is a part of their SDK that you could write plugins in Unity to make use of, which will put text on a separate non-time warped layer so that it won't get blurred even if the rest of the frame does. So that's something you could look into for that. So you mentioned, so someone asked that I mentioned Carl has a talk. Yes, it's called Genius Loki. It is on the Vision Summit YouTube page. That link is in the PDF, at least to the whole Vision Summit page, and then you can find his talk underneath there. I really would recommend going to it. I went to it when I was at Vision Summit because I just knew nothing about what he was talking about. I have not tried someone asked if I had tried Avegan Glyph. It sounds like a Unity package potentially for text. I haven't tried that. Carl Calloward. Okay, cool. So people are answering this here. Oh, I missed someone's question. My apologies. I don't know if I can find, if I owned an Oculus connected to my PC, it will be detected by Unity Editor and I will be able to preview my scenes in VR as I do, say in the game sub window. Yes, so that is exactly how it works. Once you check that box and add Oculus as a device, it will, when you hit play, your game view is, that checkbox updates the main view. So what the cool thing is, if you're an artist, actually, that's a good question. If you're an artist and you want to see something in 3D on your Oculus, you don't even need to know how to program. You can fire up Unity, drag and drop your art assets into there, throw it into the scene, put on your HMD, and you can look around your scene, at least from a fixed position, without writing a line of code. And I think we're out of, and I think we're supposed to end a little bit to give you time before your next talk. So I'm going to take this as the last question. For a solo developer, aside from the Unity forum, where is another good place to get help with Unity and ask questions? Yes, I would say consider joining the Slack channels that are VR specific. There is a link in the resources PDF that I list 2 Slack channels that you can sign up for. I think you have to apply for it, so you might have to introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your project. But that, to me, is like the pulse of VR development. That is where you can be it's real time. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending the talk. I hope you got something out of it, and I'm excited that you are all considering VR, at least interested about it. And feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions that I didn't answer. And yeah, people are putting my Twitter so you can follow. I don't post a lot though. So at least I'll say this, on the signal to noise ratio, you don't have to worry about me spamming your Twitter. So, all right, I have a few mentoring sessions, so I will be over there in a second to meet with you guys.